Well, welcome back everyone to the Mind of Watercolor Workshop, Part 2, and this is the second part of our landscape demo also. What I'm going to do now is build some tree line here. For the color, I'm going to be mixing the Prussian blue again with some azo green. Azo green is a very yellow green, but I'll probably be dabbing in bits of Indian yellow and maybe some other colors just to break it up a little bit. And I start with a fairly light color to help me block in the forms. Okay, and these shapes I'm going to try to keep wet because I need to do a lot of modeling with shadow, and I'm just bringing it down here and prepping this area so that it breaks up into a weedy foreground, a light weedy foreground. And while it's wet, I'm going to tip some of the shadow areas with Prussian blue. Maybe get a little bit of ultramarine in there. And my light source is coming from this direction, so shadow side will be on this side. I'm just using a dry round, my number 10 round. I'm pulling that color down in here. Now because this is all wet, these little tip ends with shadow are going to move out and soften pretty quickly and easily. So you want to get them pretty dark. And get some texture that will work on those foreground grasses here, but just by brushing my finger. As the gloss and the sheen comes off of your wash, you want to reduce the amount of water you're using. You can keep a fairly heavy pigment in there, but otherwise you'll start to get a back run. So while it's still damp, I'm going to come in here with my round. It's slightly damp, and I'm lifting. Okay. Basically, I'm scrubbing back some of the paint in the highlight areas. And it's just adding some nice dimension in here. The paint is still damp, and as I scrub it a little bit with a damp brush, it loosens the paint, and then I dry my brush out and it picks up really nicely. We're going to let that dry and come back in a bit. Alright, continuing to move forward, I'm going to work this area next. I want to keep these foreground areas, at least the majority of the mass of the area, very light, because I'm looking to add some stark contrast in places. Start out with smaller areas. The larger an area you work, the harder it is to keep up with it. Meaning things start to happen fast. And, you know, you've got to manage things as the water moves and as the paper dries out. You have to keep adjusting the moisture in your brush, and different parts of the paper will start to dry at different intervals. So you have to be mindful of where your paper is at all points. Now I'm looking to create a gash down here coming off the hill, sort of like a little dip. So, and I'm wanting to keep it very light, very bright. I wet all this area, so I'm wanting some of this yellowish hue to go up into those weeds. Really heavy pigment down on there. Well, to quote Mr. Happy Trees, Bob Ross, there are no mistakes, only happy accidents. True even with oils, but it is much more true with watercolor. You will have things happen in every single painting you do that you did not expect, and you've got to go with the flow, no pun intended. Because if you don't, you're just going to frustrate yourself, and you're going to end up, trying to force things. And that's another reason that I use the term in my YouTube channel, The Mind of Watercolor, is because watercolor has a mind of its own sometimes, or it seems like it does. And if you're constantly trying to force it to do things without playing by its rules, you're going to be super, super frustrated. Well, this down in here, I think I'm going to leave. I want that real nice and bright and light. And I got darker things coming in over this. So I'm going to focus in this area up here. And I'm going to switch from my oval wash to my round. The sheen is still on the paper, so it's largely still workable. Now I'm mixing Prussian blue and some azo green. Just a very favorite green mixture of mine. I'll get some soft vegetation going up in here. I'm going to carry some sort of hard edge stuff up here to kind of bring this hill forward from that distant hill. You got to look for these nice little areas of contrast. And one of the chief mistakes is in watercolor is not, it's mainly with beginners, is not enough contrast. Not creating, nice little dynamic areas. A lot of beginners tend to make their watercolor all way too flat, meaning all the same value, or all similar values. And you just don't get the dynamic light play that you need that way. Maybe get out my rigger. I'm giving myself a base right here for my tree. I have a tree that's going to come out. Is going to come out of this area. You can turn the rigger on its side and do some neat little dry brush things with it. It's okay to bring out some little detail areas like that, but don't get carried away with it. Leave some of these nice little fluid, soft areas. That's what watercolor excels at. And if too much, or if not enough contrast, is one of the chief mistakes. Probably second to it is overworking. Watercolor is an easy medium to overwork because it's so transparent. And I'm going to let that area dry. Alright, so now I'm going to work on the foreground here. I have a fairly dark clump of stuff here, and I might throw in a couple rocks. I'm just mixing a little bit of sepia and Payne's gray, so I'll come up with a fairly neutral gray. I am going to put in a couple rocks, so I'm going to lightly just indicate where they are so I can paint around that. And rather than pre-wet the area, I'm just going to go right in with some green. I want to see where I'm putting this down. I'm trying not to get into the rocks I just painted there yet, or they'll bleed. I'll blend this part out down to the bottom. Rinse my brush some more clean water. We'll pull that green up into those little grassy areas. So now everything should be bleeding and blending and mingling. I'm crossing over from the wet area into the dry. So I'll get some blending and some hard edging, which is exactly what I'm looking for. And a little Payne's gray. I want to get some pretty striking deep tones in here. Yeah, so I like those little shocks of yellow there. Pull out a few things here. Now I'm going to get my sprayer, and I mentioned this earlier, I'll be talking about this. The thing about a trigger sprayer is that when you pull the trigger just very slightly, you get spatter. If you pull it hard and firm, you get a spray, but if you just barely squeeze that thing back, you get spatter. Let's see what happens. Where the spatter hits the already painted parts, you get a lot of these little mini back runs, which look like little spots, little water spots. Where it hits the dry, you get little wet areas that if you paint into, they will sometimes take the paint and move it out into little wet foliage looking things. It's just a really neat technique. So I can take my rigger and I can pull up some of this dark paint and I can pull it through some of those water sprinkles and it just starts painting little leafy things for me. And up here I'm just blending the edge of that wash so that it goes on up into that grassy area. And here, I'm getting excited about the composition because it's working out well, and the thumbnail that I did has really helped me because I'm getting a leading eye thing. And when I add these trees in here, I'll have a composition that brings you into it. I get really excited when watercolor, when I'm working to the strengths of watercolor, and it's partnering with me and just giving me excitement and things that I hadn't imagined. I mean, some of this foliage, the expression of this foliage and all, I couldn't have imagined that. Not precisely. I mean, I might have been able to work it. But watercolor, it's almost like the mind of watercolor is saying, okay, I see what you're doing here. You set some pretty neat conditions for me. Now, here, let me take it and I'll paint some of this for you. It's exciting. I think we've got the foundation here for a really nice finishing of detail. After this dry, we'll come back and I'll add these trees up here. Now, usually when you do trees, you want to paint the foliage first before you paint the trunks. And reason for that is because being a transparent medium, you want to know where to paint your trunks, where they disappear into the foliage and go beyond. Some people will just, if it's very sparse foliage, they'll just go ahead and paint the trunks first and then sprinkle in some foliage. I'm going to go ahead though and paint in the foliage first, just in case. Now here I'm going to use my little spritzing technique again. I have the trigger, and again I'm just very lightly pulling it so that I don't get a spray. What I get is a spatter. I'm just dotting the paint, and those little sprinkles are taking the paint and moving it. So you can see there what the little droplets are doing. And you can touch some of these little clumps of leaves together and they'll flow together and whatnot. But I think that's all I'm going to do. And those will come alive once I add the tree branches. So again, we're back to a stage where I'm going to let that dry. I'm just going to take a little sepia now and pop in these main tree trunks. And down here where it touches the ground, I'm just going to use my finger and break it up a little bit, let it blend in with the ground, and maybe tap in some color. It's good to add a little shadow where the trunk disappears into a clump of foliage. That kind of helps the eye make sense out of the dimension. I'm going to switch to my rigger and start popping in some of these light branches. Riggers make fantastic branches, little branch objects. Just have an expressiveness to them that even a fine normal brush doesn't have. Probably because of the spring in the tip due to the length. On places I want to push the shadows in a little bit and maybe add a few little grassy details. But other than that, there's not a lot I need to do. I'm going to render this rock here. And I think I may add some spatter over here. One of the things I didn't mention in my beginning list of supplies is sometimes I use a white jelly roll pen. You can also use gouache for this or white acrylic. But I just like these, and a lot of watercolor purists will tell you this is a no-no, but that's hogwash. I just use it to fringe out some of these little grasses. Sometimes I'll use it for, a little branchy thing like this. What I like about them is they're permanent, and they're a little semi-transparent. They're not fully opaque, so you can see some of the underlying color. But they're permanent so that when you go back over it with a wash, you can tint them and they don't loosen up. Last but not least, I think I'm going to put a little spatter over here just to kind of break up this line and add a little interest in this big light area here. This is a fairly accurate way to place spatter. And if you like your painting without it, then don't do it. I like it. I think that's just enough and not too much. Well, and here's the finished piece. I'm pretty happy with that. And I hope you enjoyed following along with me. Hope you'll go back and review some parts if you're having trouble with it. Pause the video, try it, replay it. Ask me questions about the process if you're unsure. And I hope to see you in the next workshop where we'll get started on a rose and a botanical style. And we'll learn how to use some very tightly rendered glazes. Look forward to seeing you there. Bye-bye.